Hi, this is my video on resting local and action potential, and this is my diagram of a cell membrane with a sodium-potassium pump pumping out and in. We have sodium ions, we have potassium ions, we have extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid here. And we basically, what happens, we have a neuron uses the sodium-potassium pumps to continually make sure that sodium ions exist in a higher concentration out here in the ECF, and that the potassium ions exist in a higher concentration in the ICF. And while both of these ions are positive, the sodium ions and the potassium ions, in the ICF there are also cellular proteins that cancel potassium's positive charge, and this creates a negativity about the ICF, and also adding to that is the sort of constant diffusion to some degree of potassium ions out to the extracellular fluid. The difference, the negativity and the positivity, means that the plasma membrane has electrical potential at the membrane, and this is called the resting membrane potential, which describes the actual value of electrical potential of the plasma membrane when it is ready, at rest and ready to send signals down its length. The measured value of this state is -70 millivolts, and it's also set at this point, when at resting potential, to be at a polarized state, which simply means sodium ions are outside, potassium ions are inside. So when it's ready at this point to receive stimulus, we will switch our diagrams and set up for, let's see, local potential. Basically, when a dendrite is stimulated, the sodium gates will open. In this diagram, they are closed, but they will open up, and sodium ions will diffuse into the intracellular fluid, and the influx of cations of sodium disrupts that -70 millivolt resting membrane potential, causing it to become more positive. And any shift in membrane potential in a positive direction is called depolarization. So the opening of this gate and diffusion of these sodium ions into the ICF at the site of the stimulation causes neighboring sodium gates to open as well. And basically that kind of signal is called a local potential, and it has the following characteristics. It's graded, meaning it can vary in magnitude depending on the strength of the stimulus to the dendrites. The more stimulation that occurs, the more sodium channels will open, and the more these sodium ions will enter into the ICF and depolarizing the membrane to a greater degree. They're decremental, meaning that the current gets weaker the farther away from the site of the stimulation it gets. So if the site of the stimulation is here, as it goes out further, it gets weaker. And it's reversible, meaning that if the stimulation stops, the membrane will return to resting membrane potential. And that's due to the fact that these sodium gates close again without stimulation, and the pumps can return the sodium ions back out to the ECF. So if the stimulation in the dendrites is strong enough to pass through the soma into the axon hillock, we have what's called an action potential rather than local potential. And action potential has different characteristics. It follows an all or nothing law. If the local potential that reaches the axon hillock is strong enough to trigger an action potential, it occurs at full strength. If not, nothing happens, no action potential. They're not graded. They're non-decremental. Action potentials maintain full strength down the entire length of the axon, regardless of distance, and they're irreversible. Once an action potential starts, it cannot be stopped. So when the action potential is happening, going through the soma and reaches the axon hillock, it begins to depolarize the hillock's resting membrane potential, the negative 70 millivolts. And okay, so the sodium gates open, and the membrane potential has to reach a threshold to reach a threshold to create the action potential. It has to be negative 55 millivolts. Hopefully that made sense. Once the threshold is reached, the abundant sodium gates in the membrane of the hillock, this area, open rapidly, and sodium ions are diffusing into the ICF, and that causes the membrane potential to undergo a rapid depolarization that will see the value of the ICF go from the negative 55 to 0, and then to a positive, up to a positive 35 millivolts. And at 35 millivolts, which is considered peak value of an action potential, the sodium gates will close and the potassium gates will open, and the potassium ions in the ICF diffuse out to the ECF, and that will cause the membrane potential to undergo rapid repolarization and a shift in the voltage back to negative values. And when the value of negative 70 millivolts is achieved again, the potassium gates will close. With both gates closed, the sodium-potassium pumps are able to return the cations to their original locations, and it allows the membrane to be recovered and ready to do all of this again. Thank you.